Before I do anything else, I'd like to thank our generous hosts, represented here Father Carlos Keane, and I make use of the Penn Newman Center for this event and for the workshop that preceded it. More on that in a moment. I'm Dr. Cheeley, and on behalf of the Collegium Institute, I'd like to thank you for joining us. I'd also like to ask, first of all, if you can hear me. Is it carrying, Father Chris? Yeah?
Pull the mic up, please.
Pull it up. I'm going to just control it. Ah, here we go. A 3-day intensive workshop on Catholicism and the common good, which was generously sponsored by the Connolly Foundation for 23 high school students in the greater Philadelphia area. I'd like to commend these students for committing their time and energy in a countercultural program. And I'm calling it countercultural in part because it comes with no self-promoting credential, no course credit hours. It's merely here for the sake of forming our minds, hearts, and souls as servant leaders for others in community, steeped in the gospel and the wisdom of the Catholic tradition. I've been impressed throughout these 3 days, 3 hot, grueling days. I've been impressed with your endurance, as well as your diligence and resolve. May you continue in confidence with God's grace, and as St. John Paul II has admonished us, exhorted us, be not afraid. I'd also like to thank my colleagues for assembling such a rich workshop featuring lectures, seminars, and small groups, architectural tours, and campus poetry tours, as well as a street walking service project, daily liturgies, and communal meals. So thank you, especially to our program coordinator, Emmy Brown, to brothers Christopher Daniel and John Henry Peters, our Dominican summer interns. Highly recommend that you get yourself some of those. As well as to Miriam Shah, our Penn undergraduate summer intern, to Dr. Terrence Sweeney, our philosopher, theologian, and scholar in residence, and Jess Sweeney, as well as Isabel and Nora, a very important part of the team. I don't see them, nor do I hear them. Maybe they're out in the hall. And I'd also especially like to thank Jose Perez Benzo, the managing director of our Young Catholic Leaders Program. It's fitting that we conclude this summer workshop on the common good with our Archbishop Emeritus. He last spoke for Collegium about 5 years ago, in fall 2016, on the release of a quite remarkable study issued by the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society. That study was entitled, "How Catholic Places Serve Civic Purposes: The Archdiocese of Philadelphia's Economic Halo Effect." Here's an excerpt from what he said back then. See if it sounds familiar. "We're living through a time of tension and deep division in our country. It's easy to become cynical. Today's data remind us that a lot of good is being done every day. It's being done by ordinary people who don't make the headlines, but who do make a big difference in the lives of thousands of our region's young persons and people in need. As this study shows," and here's where we get to the meat of the study, "the positive economic impact of Catholic ministries in the greater Philadelphia region is about," anyone want to guess, or venture a guess? The economic impact of Philadelphia's Catholic ministries. Got some quantitative people here. $4.2 billion annually. Was that what you were going to say, Isaiah?
I want to say a 4.
Okay, 4. Yes. $4.2 billion annually. And we can compare that to the city of Philadelphia's owned $4 billion general fund budget for that same fiscal year, 2016. He continues, that's a lot of impact. It includes the various education and social welfare efforts directly linked to the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and its 200 plus parishes. And it also includes the region's many independent Catholic nonprofits, hospitals, universities, and similar institutions. Of course, and even more importantly, the positive human impact of all these ministries in terms of the formation of moral character, the creation of opportunities, and crucially, the transmission of hope is beyond measuring. The lesson is this: faith matters. And I would venture to say, I think the same has got to be true today. Faith matters. We need faith to matter. Perhaps now more than ever. His latest book that has just come out last spring, Things Worth Dying For. And I should note, and some of you have already found, that we had 20 copies of his book available for sale at $15 each, steeply discounted, from 25% off the Amazon price. And that's because, yes, we are attempting to undercut Amazon. So we may not have 20 left, but first come, first served. And I've seen a number of you have already come with these books to be signed. So I don't know how many are left. But this book has remained on Amazon's top 50 books on Catholicism since its publication this past spring. And here a quote from one of the 155 reviews posted. Through a chapter on irony and others on God and political ideologies, country and community, family and friends, this book ultimately makes the case for us to set aside the time, even on a daily basis, to reflect on the character of our loves. And it matters that we get them right. Not all are equally worthy. Some are dangerous, and others are enslaving. But of them all, this is the truth. And here, quoting from the book itself. Love is demanding. It draws us outside of ourselves. The more we love, the greater our willingness to sacrifice. When we know honestly what we're willing to sacrifice for, even to die for, we can see the true nature of our loves. And that tells us who we really are. And so this book about dying well, fundamentally, is about how to save our lives. That is, about how to save them for something worth living for. And that brings us to the subject of this evening's conversation. A common good worth living for. So please join me in welcoming Archbishop Emeritus Charles Chaput.
Hello, everybody. It's good to see you out there. I didn't look behind me. I see we have a full room. I'm very happy about that and honored by your presence. But I'm not going to speak to most of you. I'm going to speak to these high school students. Because they were the group that I was asked to come for, and I didn't realize the rest of you would be here. So my reflections will be directed primarily at them. Here's that book he talked about. Everybody, all my friends want a copy, but they want me to give it to them free. So that's not much of a commitment on their part, I don't think, to the book. When you're young, I think most of you are probably under 18, somewhere between 14 and 18. Thinking of death is not something you want to do, nor is it probably something you think you need to do for a long time, until somebody your age dies in a car accident, and then it becomes more of a reality, a sad reality for you. It's always been part of the Catholic tradition that one of the best ways to live a good life is to think often about dying. I don't know if you know what Catholic holy cards are. Young people may not know what they're those little picture cards that you get at sacred events like ordinations and anniversaries of priests and stuff like that. Oftentimes there's a picture of one of the saints holding a skull, or he's sitting at a desk writing something and there's a skull, a skeleton head on his desk. And I think a lot of young people, a lot of people who don't know the Catholic tradition think this is really weird. You know, it's so sad and so gruesome. But it's always been part of the Catholic tradition that if you understand that what we're doing now, you know, our 70, 80, 90 years of life is really preparation for a much longer life, which we call eternity, then the best way to prepare for eternity is have one eye on it and the other eye on what you're doing now. And that means you think about death, not about the pain of dying, but about the possibility of eternal life. And if that's part of your thinking, your motivation, it really makes you live life in a different kind of way. Now I want to begin my reflections. I have a 3-page talk here, but we'll see if I get to it. I want to begin my reflection by asking you a question. So I hope you don't mind me doing that, and I hope you won't be shy about giving your response. I want to know what you learned, and the most important thing you should have learned is what is the common good, because that's the kind of the theme of the time together. So can somebody among these high school students tell me what is the common good? Somebody's almost raising her hand. Well, you know that, I don't want you to be, you know, okay, fine.
Well, during the 3 days here, we kind of learned about the common good through the different necessary societies. And we focus on the common good as working kind of for the benefit of all people in the family, in the state, as in the government state, and in the church, and how kind of we can better serve that.
That's excellent. That's very good. I think, you know, I ask most people of what the common good is, and they say, well, that what makes the largest number of people happy. But that's not what the common good is. That's the good of the majority, right? And the common good is the good of everyone. And sometimes to make everyone not happy in the sense of playful happiness, but about deep human happiness, sometimes to make that happen, you have to be willing to sacrifice something yourself. And, you know, not focus on me, but focus on we, you know, the community. And even those you disagree with, and people who are in the minority, what is the best thing for all of us, whether we know it or whether we like it or not, you know? So sometimes serving the common good might mean displeasing the majority, because what they want isn't really good. So it's the good of the community, the human community, whether they're Catholics or Protestants or Buddhists or Muslims or non-believers, or you agree with them or you don't. We have to care about everyone. And so all Catholic moral life is based on two things: respect for the dignity of every individual without exception. Doesn't mean you agree with them all the time. Doesn't mean you even respect their opinions. They may have wrong opinions. But you respect them. And they know you respect them. You don't just say you respect them, but they never respect them because of the way you act. So that's one important pillar, you know, the dignity of every individual without exception. And the other is commitment to the common good. And how you put all that together is sometimes complicated and difficult, but that should be the goal of all of our moral life. Every one of our moral decisions is based on a commitment to those two basic principles. Now, do you ever hear that in church? Do priests ever preach about that on Sunday Mass? Probably not, you know. And it's foundational, you know, it's kind of the, but they don't preach about the Trinity very often either, and that's the most important doctrine of the Catholic Church. So we don't often preach about the things that are most important because we take them for granted. We presume everybody knows. But we don't, and we soon forget. Not only do we not know, but we often forget. And so I'm really grateful. You gave a wonderful answer, which means you're dealing with the issue in this reflection you've had together, and that's a very, very good thing. I'm going to begin my reflections by talking about Justice Clarence Thomas. Do any of you know who he is? You know, I am 76 years old, and a lot of things I presume you don't never experience. I still think you all were there when John Kennedy was assassinated. And you don't even remember 9/11 personally, let alone the assassination of John Kennedy. But Clarence Thomas has been one of the justices of the Supreme Court for more than 30 years. Before I begin my reflections and talk about him, I just want to tell you a little bit about him. He was born in Georgia, grew up in South Carolina in a very, very, very poor African-American family, descendant of slaves on both sides of his family. And his first language wasn't even English. There's a Creole in that part of the South that I don't know how to even pronounce what it is, but that wasn't his first language. He was a Catholic. He was raised a Catholic. He was born a Catholic. And he went to seminary in high school, and then he went to college seminary. And at the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King, he was disillusioned because of the racist remarks of fellow seminarians, saying that it was a good thing that Martin Luther King was killed. Seminarians said that, somebody studying with the priesthood. So he left the seminary, and eventually he left the church for complicated reasons. Part of it because he didn't think the church had a commitment to overcoming racism. One of the things he said is if the church had as much a commitment to overcoming racism in the 1960s as the church has for opposing abortion, things would be very different today. And I think it's true. Both of them are terrible sins against what? First principle of Catholic social is the dignity of every individual, right? Unborn children are massacred by abortion. That's not showing them respect and respecting their dignity. And racism it's a sacrilege to be a racist, because you're showing disrespect to God's creation, to one of God's daughters and sons. And it's a horrible sin. So we need to be absolutely opposed to both. And don't you ever decide you have to be in one camp over the other. You hear that today, that if you want to be a social justice Catholic, you can't be opposed to abortion, because that's the conservative people's side. And so many of our Catholic politicians get in the position of embracing one side of the Catholic social teaching without the whole. And we can't make an exception ever. We have to be committed to both all the time. Well, eventually, he got married and he divorced his first wife, and I think he left the church for a while. This is Justice Thomas, and in the 1990s, he was reconciled to the church and came back, I think through the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., and really is an extraordinary Catholic. Back in the church, calling us to reform appropriately, especially on the areas of race, and has been an extraordinary Catholic. But I wanted you to know that background about him before I begin my more formal reflections, okay? And then I'm going to open up our time together for your reflections and questions, okay? So here I go. I'm going to kind of stick to my text or I'll go on too long. I've already done that probably. One of my longtime heroes is Justice Clarence Thomas. He was born poor. His father abandoned the family when he was young, I think 1 or 2 years old, maybe 3 years old. And he grew up in the South in a culture where being African American was often a source of racial discrimination. Despite that, he studied and worked his way up to a very successful political and legal career. He lived through periods of vicious allegations and unjust criticism, and yet he never became bitter, never retreated into fear, never betrayed his convictions, never abandoned his commitment to public service, and never allowed himself to be poisoned by the lies and hatred of his enemies. Now that's quite an accomplishment for anyone to do that. He's a man of deep personal integrity. That's one of the things we should be willing to die for, our personal integrity, who takes his Catholic faith and its public implications very seriously. And the result is that many of his Supreme Court opinions are models of Christian-informed legal thought in the service of our nation's common good. Because he's a serious Catholic. I mentioned Justice Thomas because one of his best quotations speaks to our purpose tonight. He once said, "You have to decide what you're willing to die for. Unless you know that, you're negotiable." It means you can be bought. By negotiable, he means so light in moral substance that you can float on the wind and blow in whatever direction it's moving. You make your decisions based on what everybody else thinks, whether it's true or not. Substance matters, my dear young brothers and sisters. Convictions matter. They root us in the earth. They give us the gravity to stand upright in a storm. And that's what you need to do. You have to develop a kind of human integrity and strength that you stand up in the storm of all that's going on around you. Here's the point. When we talk about things worth dying for, the title of my book, we're really talking about things that are worth living for. The things we love, the things we believe in, the things we believe in so strongly that they shape our life and our actions. Our actions should always be shaped by what we believe and not by other kind of things. The things we're willing to work for, to suffer for, and to serve others by our behavior. All human beings are believers in something. No one is really an unbeliever, even if they tell you they are. Not everyone is religious, but everyone believes something. I believe in God is a statement of faith. So is, I believe there is no God. There's no way of proving that God exists scientifically, but there's no way of proving that God doesn't exist scientifically. So both those who say they believe and those who say they don't are making statements of faith. People will organize very good arguments and facts to support each of these two conflicting statements. But ultimately, they choose one or the other, or they pretend not to choose, and then proceed to reason and act accordingly. So there's always a reason underlying our actions. Sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't. The reason people believe in things is because human beings are naturally wired for meaning. It's in our DNA as a species. We're not just here in the present, like dogs and cats, with no awareness of past or future. Dogs and cats don't bury their dead. They're not even aware that they're going to die, or maybe that they're living. They just live from moment to moment with no awareness of the past or future. But you and I, we're different. We have memory. That's all you are, really. You're a globule of memories. The memories of your relationships with your moms and dads, your brothers and sisters, your friends, and that's who you are. If you just sit here for a moment, close your eyes and think, who am I? You think of all the relationships you've had. You are your memories. We have memory. And because we have memories, we have hopes about the present and about the future. We hanker for purpose. We long for something more than just the next 24 hours. We can try to invent a meaning for ourselves, which ends up, finally, translating into no meaning at all. We can try to avoid the question of meaning with an addiction to work, or to money, or to sex, or to drugs, or toys, or drugs. They don't work. but it's a way of avoiding the question of the meaning of life. None of these things feed the soul or answer the deepest questions of our hearts. And we can give ourselves to the wrong kind of meaning with extreme politics and destructive ideas on the left or the right that become a kind of false religious zealotry and a weapon against people we dislike. Unfortunately, that seems to be where our country is much of the time these days. No one talks about anything or discusses anything. They just shout at each other and hate the other side. But there's nothing progressive or enlightened about hatred. It's a terrible kind of thing. Hatred and resentment are terrible kinds of things that deaden our souls. And yet, so much of what claims to be progressive thought today is thick with impatience and intolerance for any disagreement. The cancel culture, which unfortunately is embraced by many young people like yourselves, is really based on hatred and a refusal to discuss and dialogue. Instead of discussing things with people with whom you disagree, you decide to cancel them or cancel the subject. So it's important for us as we try to develop our own future, and that's what your young lives are about, to try your best to understand what gives meaning to human life, and to learn that from your family, from your church, from your school, and from your friends. Family, church, friends, these are the glue of fruitful human relations. They enable us to live in peace with each other rather than prey on each other. They are the pillars of shared, healthy society. Much of what you said in your response to my question about what is the common good. But unfortunately, these societies, family, church, and the like, are under derision and assault. One of the ironies of the modern world is that as belief in hell and in the next life have declined, we've become very skilled at replicating hell in our politics right here and now in this life. And that's very, very bad. In the end, the things worth dying for are really very few and very simple. They're also profoundly important. The list is short. God, you'd expect me to say that. I hope all of you would say that. Our faith, again, you'd expect me to say that. I hope you believe it. Our church. But also our family, which is the first community in our life. And it's the school through which everything else passes. Our friends. Friends are very important to you at your age. Friends who teach us how to love and sustain us in our sorrow, joys, and hopes. It's so important to have good friends who support us and then also shove us when we need to be shoved. Other things that are important in the list of things to be willing to die for are our personal integrity, which makes us human and guards our character. It's so important not to be a liar to others or to yourself or to God. Also, our country, at least the best ideals of our country. I have a chapter in my book on patriotism, which isn't spoken about very often these days. I don't know if you have Pledge Allegiance in your schools anymore, but many schools have gotten rid of that, 4th of July celebrations used to be a celebration where we focused on our country and its history. I think for most people today, it's just another time to have a cookout and a party. We don't pay too much attention to the history of our country. But this can be a worrisome thing, because the United States, more than any country in the world, is an artificial country. We don't have a common language here. We don't have a common culture. That we all come from different places, right? Radically different places. We have different ethnicities or different religions. The only thing that holds us together is our belief in the Constitution and our commitment to it. And if we don't have a we don't understand the Constitution, or think it's very important, or think we can change it pretty easily, and our country's in deep trouble because there's no common agreement about what should form the structure of our common life together. There was a Pew study that, you know, they do those research studies, came out in 2017, which is what, 4 or 5 years ago, that said only 44% of American young people said they'd be willing to die for our country. Now, and none of us wants to die for our country, none of us wants to go to war. But back when I was your age, everybody said they wanted to die, we would be willing to die for the country, and for God, and for the church, and for our families. I asked that question at confirmations. You know, we have confirmation generally in the 6th to 8th grade period in Philadelphia, and I asked people if they're willing to die for their church, and the young people tell me no. I mean, they're at least honest. Back in my day, everybody said yes. So, I'm getting around to the conclusion of my formal remarks. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the common good is more than the most stuff and the most options for the most people. No, it's not that at all. The horizon in that kind of materialistic world is so low that it smothers the soul. That's a very self-centered way of looking at life. We're more than an autonomous consumer unit that experts can aggregate into a giant big box store and then call a nation. We have ties that are more important. We have ties of blood and memory and experience and joy and suffering and hope and belief that bind us together in a network of rights, but also a network of mutual responsibility and obligations. One of the things I've learned over my 76 years of life is that the very last thing a rich and worthy life is about is myself. A rich and worthy life is not about me. We're small creatures until we give ourselves away in service to others. Then the world begins to change when we're willing to do that. Every act of unselfish love expands the heart and sanctifies the space and time we share with others. You know that in the Catholic community, the primary symbol is the cross. It leads our processions in church, usually in the center of the sanctuary. Many of us wear it as jewelry. I'm wearing one myself. This is called a pectoral cross, bishops wear. Even my ring as a bishop is a sign of a cross. And the reason for that isn't because Jesus suffered on the cross. We know he did. But the cross is not supposed to be for us a sign of suffering. It's supposed to be for us a sign of sacrifice. You know, Jesus gave himself, opened his arms wide, embraced the world, and died for all of us. And that self-giving love is what makes people happy. It makes marriages successful. It's why we love our mothers and celebrate Mother's Day, because they love us that way. Hopefully our fathers do, but they don't say it as much as our mothers do. But that's what makes a happy child, if he has a mother and father who love each other and who love him or her selflessly, without consideration of themselves. So, you and I are in the world to be witnesses and leavens for the good. So have courage, have faith in Jesus Christ, and be the seeds of renewal in our nation and in our culture. That's what God calls you to be. So that's my reflections. So, in response to that, do any of you have any challenges? I'm happy to take challenges.